Alright, this video is going to be the first of a multiple part series in how to approach the new free response questions on the redesigned version of the AP US Government Test. There will be a couple of handouts that will go along with this that will be posted on both my website and on your Google Classroom, but the kind of thing that we'll focus on is kind of talking about all of the free response questions in general in this portion and how to approach writing a free response question. And then in subsequent videos, we'll talk about how to answer each of the individual new styles of questions on the exam. So the first question we have to ask if we're going to play with how to do a free response question is, what is a free response question? It's a 100-minute period where you're going to answer 4 different questions, or 4 different styles of questions. So these are what your 4 types of questions look like on the new version of the AP exam. The first kind of question is a concept application question, where you're going to respond to a political scenario, explaining how it relates to an institution, behavior, or process. The example that you'll see in the new course and exam description book is using a shortened version from, I think it's the Washington Post, talking about spikes in the price of the EpiPen, and it asks you how Congress could respond to that issue, how Congress's action could then be connected to an executive branch response, and then how other linkage institutions like political parties could respond to the actions of either Congress or the executive. The quantitative analysis question asks you to work with quantitative data. You're looking at a trend or a pattern. You're looking at conclusions from graphic maps. You're looking and interpreting data and then connecting the dots between institutions and processes. So it's the exact same type of skill set that the first question assesses, but it is based off of a visual graphic prompt instead of a text-based prompt. Number 3 is entirely new to the AP exam. It's the Supreme Court comparison question, where it will give students a prompt from a non-required Supreme Court case. So it will give them a summary of the case, the decision of the case, and you're asked to then compare it to a given required case. It will be one of the list of the 15 required Supreme Court cases that you connect the dots between why the rulings were similar and or different. And then the final one is the argumentative essay. That question will use some form of prompt that requires you to use one or more of the 9 foundational documents that you should be working on reading throughout the semester. I'll have a video devoted to each one of these kinds of questions that will help prepare you for tests in my class, and you can use them as a refresher before you get to the actual exam. But for the last part of this first video, I kind of want to talk about some general rules or norms and processes that you can go through to more effectively answer a free response question. So here are your first set of kind of general rules or norms. These are 5 good pieces of advice that I would give you to make sure you have an easy, readable, gradable free response question. Number 1, make sure you write legibly. You have to slow down, use your big boy, big girl handwriting that got you a good grade in your 4th grade penmanship class, and you need to make sure that you read or you write in a fashion that can be read by anybody. While I or whoever your teacher is may be able to kind of acclimate to your poor handwriting throughout the semester, the person who is grading your section of the test won't be there to kind of learn your handwriting or your nuance throughout the semester. So if they can't read it, it functionally doesn't exist. So you need to slow down and attempt to write clearly as you are constructing your response. Number 2, you should definitely use pen over pencil on the exam. That when you're writing in pencil, if you're writing incredibly light, it will be harder to read, which is, kind of a violation of rule number 1. Or when you're done with the test and these tests get kind of packed up and sent to where they'll be distributed to the reading, pencil markings can rub off easier than pen can on the back of other pieces of paper. So worry about writing in pen. Number 3, you should double space between each section of the question. There's a good debate as to whether or not students should letter or number the individual responses, and whether or not scores are instructed to look in those individual areas. My suggestion would be to answer your questions in the sequential order that they are given, but you should space between paragraphs or between ideas to make it easier to isolate your answer to each question, but you're not locked into a lettering or numbering system. That way, if you have some scorers who are only locked into looking in answer A for your answer to A, instead of looking across the essay, this might help give you some wiggle room if you write a little bit more disorganized. But we'll deal with organization in a second. Number 4 is answer the damn question. ATDQ. Remember that acronym, burn it into your brain. A lot of teachers are terrible at letting you get away with writing an answer to an essay question where you just kind of think about how you can move the goalpost to the question you're more comfortable answering instead of the question that's given. You can't use a Jedi mind trick. You can't move the goalpost. You can't do anything to redirect the question. That when we look at how the individual questions are scored, the scoring rubric is a fairly 1 or 0 point. It's very black and white in terms of you answering the task that's given. So answer what's asked, answer the question that they give you, not the one you wish they asked you. And then number 5, answer all parts of every question. The only students that I've had that have done poorly on this section of the test either forget to answer every letter for every question, or they'll look at a question and go, I got no idea, and they'll give up and move on. Guess, right? The attempt at getting a point, some points are better than no points. You might dumb luck your way into an answer. That just moving past, a question that you think you have absolutely no knowledge on can hurt you. Each of these questions have a fairly easy piece to them, right? Can you read and identify a concept? Can you look at a chart and identify a trend? Can you remember a clause from 2 Supreme Court cases? Can you remember one of your foundational documents? These are all things that you should be able to do that get you at least 1 of the points on each essay, even if you can't go to the depth or don't feel confident in the rest. Guess. You can only, luck your way into points. This is the Michael Scott, Wayne Gretzky quote of, you can never, miss the shots you don't take. So if you remember these 5 things, then we'll talk next about how to unpack a question in general, and then we'll look at individual examples of questions in later videos. So the first thing you should do in unpacking a question is identify the verbs. The verbs are crucial in identifying either what kind of written answer is expected or how much of a written answer is expected to get your point or points per question. And what I've got for you is a list of verbs that frequently show up on AP exams that are worth knowing. Now, this is a list that I gave to students for the old exam, or what we are now calling the legacy exam, but I think in looking at some of the questions that I've seen from the first couple of released and practice exams, the task-based verbs are staying fairly similar. So we'll look and talk about some of them now. Number 1 is list or identify, and this is, for me, the simplest of all of the verbs, right? If you were asked to list something, you can just give a list of 3 factors. It can be a bulleted list, it can be a numbered list. If it's something that can be identified, identifying can be a simple 2-word answer. Now, if you're, super anal retentive and feel like you have to write in complete sentences, you can for this, but focus on creating that list. Define means what it does in any other context. If you're defining a word, you're writing the definition of that term and hopefully showing your understanding of that definition. Beyond this is where it seems like we're, creating artificial distinctions between terms. So this is I'll kind of do my best to kind of create distinctions for you between the rest of the verbs. Describe is essentially define with more depth. That a description is providing a portrayal of a phenomena. It's drawing a picture of what's going on. Descriptions tend to address questions that deal with what. And the example that I give here is from my CompGov class, but if you're asked to describe a political cleavage in Mexico, you need to be able to talk about both sides of that cleavage, right? What are the two groups that are at odds? What's the issue that is creating the wedge? Discuss is a verb that is popping up more often on the comparative test than the AP government, US government test, but discuss is essentially describe with more depth. Explain feels the same thing as describe or discuss, but an explanation tends to look at a causal relationship. So you are, instead of describing like a relationship between two variables, two phenomenon, you are explaining how or why the connection exists. You are explaining why X leads to Y. You are building bridges, you are building connections between the items of the question that is given to you. Compare and contrast is something that will show up more and more frequently, especially in the world of the comparative Supreme Court question and the argumentative essay. This is asking you to make links between specific concepts, specific occurrences, specific phenomena, or in the CompGov world, creating connections between countries. This is not simply, looking at two examples in isolation. And again, this is a CompGov example. But if you're asked to describe or compare and contrast the political participation of women in Iran and Nigeria, you can't write a paragraph about Iran and a paragraph about Nigeria and go, see, we're good. That is a comparison, maybe, but not really, because you're just looking at those two countries in isolation. So to correctly compare the comparison, there must be cross-paragraph references. So here's a right that women have in Nigeria but not Iran. Here's a statistic that impacts Iran but not Nigeria, and an explanation of why that distinction exists. For a comparison or a contrast, it is important to note similarities and differences. The last one is evaluate and assess, and this is essentially creating something that is measurable. So how well does something meet a standard? I've seen evaluate or assess, again, more often on the comparative questions than I have the US questions, but these kinds of questions tend to, have a thesis, and I think you might see evaluate or assess show up more often in the world of the argumentative essay, because this is a thesis-driven argument question. So I'll talk about evaluate and assess more so when we get to answering or dealing with that kind of question. The last one is analyze, and it's breaking a phenomenon into its composite parts. So if you were asked to analyze the legislative process, right, you wouldn't just talk about how it goes from the House and the Senate to the President, right? You would have to break down each element of the process and give how each element of that process or how each piece of that process kind of contributes to the whole. At the end of the day, regardless of the verb, you should focus on writing a clear, concise, and well-supported response. You should try to use concrete examples when necessary. You should be thesis-driven when necessary. And the more clear and to the point you are, the more likely you are to earn your point than trying to ramble into making an argument. Step 2 of unpacking a question is organization, right? You're going to have 100 minutes to answer 4 questions. So think of it as having 25 minutes per question. Some questions may take more time, some may take less time, but you're going to write a sloppy essay unless you sit down and kind of brainstorm your answer to each one. So think about how to write it. For these free response questions, they do not have to be the flowery, rhetorically pleasing crap that your DBQ might have to be in APUSH or Euro, or something that, you know, checks all the positive boxes of the 9-point rubric for a lit or lang essay, that we political scientists do not give a crap about your flowery BS. So you don't need an introduction or a conclusion. You are not writing a thematic essay. You are writing, you know, 3 to 5 kind of tangentially connected points. The introduction and conclusion may change when we talk about answering the argumentative essay, but not really, because you're still answering prompts in isolation. Number 2, cut the crap. Don't use overly broad statements. You know, throughout history, since the dawning of man. First of all, get rid of these. Make your statements either thesis-driven or connect them to the language of the verb that the question stem uses. Organization is important. Acknowledge that these questions will have 3 or 4, each numerical question will have 3 or 4 different lettered tasks. So focus on them, double space between each section. Don't write them in one massive incoherent paragraph, because that becomes a nightmare to score. And finally, organize your response before you sit down and write. Try and guess how many points are in each question. I'm going to guess that under the new evaluation rubric, they'll kind of show you how many points each one is worth, so you know the tasks that are given to you. But you need to brainstorm, you need to sit down. And then lastly, you need to write. Organization is key, right? Like I just said, keep your paragraph short, concise, and on task. If you are asked an opinion question, it doesn't have a right or wrong answer. The only thing that may be right or wrong is your application of any evidence that they ask you to use. You should try and use specific or factual examples whenever possible. This will be super important for the SCOTUS comparison case or the argumentative essay. And then connect the dots. Linkage is important. Make sure you're using linking language from the question that you are asked back to your response. That these are things that you work on. And if you remember these, you know, different guidelines, these should be things that lead to you getting, you know, a majority of the points on the free response questions instead of missing out on some of them. That's all for the first video. In a second video, I'm going to talk about other specific free response questions that you'll have to be able to navigate throughout the semester and the exam.